Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the 2-hour chart of silver provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. Now you can see from the volume down here, I've been pointing this out for a while. It's my opinion that this volume represents a percentage of paper longs going long in the paper markets. That's not physical. Of course it's not physical because we're talking about billions and billions of ounces of silver, so it's not physical. But it's a bet placed by these groups of people, whether they're hedge funds, commercial speculators, whoever they are. They're betting that this is going to be the bottom. Now, we had a brief spike on the opening tonight, which would have been sort of a technical breakout. But then you can see we had this big smackdown here right afterwards. Nevertheless, it really doesn't matter when we're talking about a real asset here. $20 for an ounce of silver, if you can actually get it for that. And you can if you're talking about rounds and bars if you look around for deals. But still, being able to pick up silver for $20 an ounce is such an unbelievable deal when you think about what is beginning to happen, what is going to happen. Eventually, the only assets that are going to be standing are real assets. Assets that you hold, like gold and silver, and any tangible asset. Of course, the reason why those two are the preferred money is because they're the best at that. But it could be bullets, cans of beans, bags of rice, etc. Anything tangible, because as I'm going to show when I get into the issue of sovereign immunity, which ultimately is going to be behind all of this, that government promises cannot be relied upon. Government promises are going to be broken. The reason why is government isn't in a position to make promises, and promises that are made by governments that are broken cannot be enforced. So let's go to this article. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time here on this article that's on FT. You can see it broke just a few hours ago. It's kind of interesting that we see important articles break in England that are about the United States, but this is about Chicago, and you can see here's the picture of some of the people in the unions, and it really doesn't matter how loud they scream or how much they jump up and down. They're not going to change these facts. So let's look at this article. Chicago is tackling the worst pension crisis in the U.S., but methods that got it into this bind are still used across America. Since the start of this school year, Annie Stovall has been walking her 9-year-old granddaughter Kayla across 4 blocks to Gresham Elementary on Chicago's South Side. The route takes the pair through turf claimed by rival gangs, a far more dangerous journey than to her old school, Morgan Elementary, just across the street from their house. So far, this safe passage trip, the city has hired monitors to watch over the children, has been uneventful. Kayla feels safe because I walk her to school every morning and I pick her up when it's done. My concern is how long they'll stay out here, she says, referring to the safety workers. Morgan was one of about 50 elementary schools forced to close this year, collateral damage from the ballooning pension crises in Chicago and the state of Illinois. The budget gap in Chicago's school district alone is $1 billion, mainly because of pension liabilities, while the combined unfunded pension liabilities of the city and the school district runs to over $27 billion. Rahm Emanuel, yes, that's dead fish Rahm, Chicago's Democratic mayor, has said the school closures, along with 3,000 job cuts in the school system, were necessary to close the yawning hole in the district budget. The episode has further soured the mayor's relations with the teachers' union. You can see that Democrats now are breaking with their base, which held a 7-day strike last year. Karen Lewis, head of the union, called the school closures racist and classist. So here we have Rahm Deadfish Emanuel, the Democratic power broker. Now he's taking on the teachers union, who are calling him a racist and a classist. The woes of the city and the state of Illinois, which has its own worst in the nation $100 billion unfunded pension liability, have been driven primarily by the government's failure to pay its share to keep its pension promises. Now think about that. This is going to get to the core of the issue. The government's failure to pay its share. Well, the government doesn't have any money to pay with. The government only has money that it takes from the taxpayer. And if the government is dishonest in the way that it acts as a trustee, in other words, if the government breaches its fiduciary obligation to use tax money to fund these pensions, but instead uses the pension money to pay for current expenditures, and you can see something very similar on the national scale. Social Security is the exact same thing. The federal government has used the money that has come into Social Security, and rather than investing the money, setting it aside, the government has used it to pay current expenditures. So this same thing is going to be played out on a national scale when all of the unfunded liabilities on a national level promises are broken. But this month, after years of inaction, Illinois passed a bill to tackle its unfunded pension liability. The state hopes the new law will save $160 billion over the next 30 years. Now, keep that in mind. They always make big promises way out. That's like the latest budget deal that promised to cut $20 billion a year, but that's going to be out 10 or 20 years. So politicians always do that. They always make promises on the next guy's watch. Savings that will come from cuts in retirement benefits for state workers and forcing the state to make its pension contributions. The law has won plaudits as a first step towards fiscal reform, but it comes only after repeated downgrades that have left Illinois with the lowest credit rating of any U.S. state. Now it's up to Mr. Emanuel, the hard-nosed former Obama administration official, to do the same for Chicago. Any proposal to solve the city's pension problems is bound to look much like the state deal, cutting benefits for public workers and raising contributions. Quote, the pension crisis is not truly solved until relief is brought to Chicago and all of the other local governments across our state that are standing on the brink of a fiscal cliff because of our pension liabilities, Mr. Emanuel said. So, do you see how fast the Democrats turn and blame the people that they've made promises to? That's how it works. That's what government does. As soon as you come to collect, they're going to turn and point the finger at you. It doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican. We don't find Mr. Emanuel talking about the unrealistic pension promises, the pension projections that were made by dishonest politicians in the past, etc. No, he's directly pointing his finger at the people who are going to collect the pensions. The Chicago Teachers Pension Fund is roughly 54% funded, far below the 80% threshold considered healthy, but it is better off than the city's municipal workers, police, labor, and firefighters pension funds, which Fitch, the credit rating agency, estimates are collectively 33% funded. Mr. Emanuel has warned that failing to reform Chicago's pensions by next year could force cuts in services, including the police department, at a time when the city has had the highest number of murders in the U.S. The alternative, he says, would be a 150% rise in property taxes. So you can see here now that the mayor is going to play off the rest of the population of Chicago against the government union workers. So think about that. If you're one of these leftist union Democrats, for all of these years, you've supported people like Mr. Obama and Mr. Emanuel and these Democrats. And you can see how quickly they're willing to throw you under the bus. They're done with you. They've used you, they've gotten into office, and now they're throwing you under the bus. And you can see, he says, we're either going to have cuts to police or we're going to almost double property taxes. Now, he knows when he makes that threat that neither one of those can occur, that the taxpayers are going to rebel in either case, so the only alternative is going to be cuts to the public pension system. His administration points to the recent reform of the city's Parks Department's pension system as a model. Retirement ages were raised, with workers no longer able to retire at 50. Yes, you read that. That's right. Retire at 50 with full benefits. And we wonder why we're in this situation. Do you know of anyone in the private sector that can retire at 50 with full benefits? How many years have they been running this scam? If you are someone who has been employed and retired at 50 with full benefits, I will say you are already on full notice that you're not getting your money. Because, as the saying goes, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. So retiring at 50 with full benefits is absolutely absurd in the type of austerity that we see in the private sector. And of course, we're going to see that with sovereign immunity, that ultimately it's the private sector that has to pick up the tab for this, and that's why it's not going to be paid. Retire at 50 with full benefits. Employees will pay more toward their retirements, and the city will increase its contributions. Still, Mr. Emanuel has been criticized for backing plans to delay some payments, and Moody's has attacked Chicago's latest budget for failing to set aside enough money for pensions. Now, that's not going to happen. And the unions are preparing to fight back in Chicago, just as they have against the state deal, which they are challenging in court. A coalition of unions called the state reform attempted pension theft. Mayors across the U.S. are facing predicaments similar to Mr. Emanuel's. From Detroit to Chicago to San Diego, American cities have found their budgets choked by unfunded pension obligations. Part of the national problem lies in the swelling number of pensioners and the ruinous effect of the 2008 crisis had on public finances, but mainly it's because politicians failed to pay for pension promises, choosing instead to pass the burden on to future taxpayers. Chicago and Illinois, with their worst in the nation status, are outliers. Even Detroit, whose huge pension gap was one reason it was forced to file for bankruptcy this year, is in better shape. Yet even those states and cities that paid their fair share of costs are probably understating the actual cost of the pension promises that they have made. Current rules allow them to make assumptions each year based not on what their portfolios actually earn or lose, but on what they expect to earn. Do they ever expect to lose? Because if you invest in any financial markets that I know about, you have down years. What years do they project to be down on? These expectations are often too rosy. Many state and municipal schemes assume investment returns will be much higher in future than those earned in the past decade. Even then, a pension scheme can tell members it is well funded when it only has 80% of the assets needed to meet its promises. In fiscal 2010, the most recent year in which data are available for all states, the state pension gap in the U.S. hit $757 billion, according to a report from Pew Center. But the high assumed rate of return most states use to calculate the cost of benefits understates the problem. According to research by Joshua Rau, a finance professor of Stanford University, based on a more realistic rate, the actual nationwide unfunded state pension liability would be closer to $4.5 trillion, his research has found. The standards for calculating public pension returns have long been abandoned by private sector employers in the U.S. and the U.K., and rejected by pensions regulators and accounting standards setters. In the private sector, when more realistic methods of counting the costs of pension promises were introduced, employers tended to stop making them. In other words, when private sector employers had to tell the truth, they decided to stop lying and just get out of the business. Last year, a report from the State Budget Crisis Task Force, co-chaired by former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker. This is a dummy they trot out every once in a while to tell people bad news. And financier Richard Ravitch concluded that actual shortfalls at state pension schemes may be as much as 3 times the $1 trillion their own actuaries say they are. That is because the methods used by U.S. states and cities such as Detroit, where bankruptcy proceedings threaten to turn pensioners into unsecured creditors, are standard practice at pension schemes across the country. So what's happened in Detroit is standard practice across the country. The structure and management of Detroit's pension scheme is no different from those of other municipal schemes, said Genevieve Nolan, analyst at Moody's. Often overlooked in the pension debate is the role of actuaries who assign a value, etc., etc. So I'm going to try to get down to the gist of this now. It's really, really bad news. You need to read this entire article, but I want to look at the legal justifications of this, because ultimately all of this stuff is going to end up in court, and we want to look at that. So most states protect pensions under the Contracts Clause of the U.S. Constitution, or a similar state provision which prohibits lawmakers from passing any law that impairs existing private or public contracts, according to Boston College's Center for Retirement Research. 7 U.S. states, including Illinois, Michigan, and New York, have explicit constitutional protections of public employee benefits. In Illinois, the state constitution says pension benefits are contracts, quote, that shall not be diminished or impaired, end quote. Union leaders have cited this in their legal efforts to challenge the new reform. Michigan's constitution has similar language, but Judge Stephen Rhodes, in his ruling deeming Detroit eligible for bankruptcy earlier this month, said the Constitution did not offer pensioners any special protections over other creditors. Nevertheless, the unions involved have vowed to fight on. Labor groups take some solace from a 2012 decision in Arizona where a judge ruled that a reform that would have increased employee contributions violated the state constitution's protections against the impairment of contracts between the state and its employees. So this is the concept we're going to examine here, is that this is a contract between the state and its employees. And this is the decision here. Their retirement benefits were a valuable part of the consideration offered by their employers upon which the teachers relied when accepting employment, Judge Eileen Willett of the Maricopa County Superior Court wrote in her opinion. The case ended up in state Supreme Court, which heard oral arguments last summer, but has yet to issue a ruling 2.5 years after the reform passed through the legislature. So when you see a judge talk about consideration offered, consideration is something that you see in a contract. Consideration is something that's offered by both parties. That's the key to all contract law. The first thing you do when you look at a contract to see if it's a valid contract is if both parties offered consideration. So the consideration offered by the state was these retirement benefits. And what they're saying is that these employees entered into a contract and that the state offered as consideration for that contract those retirement benefits. And therefore, the state would be in violation of its contract if it violated that clause. Now, here's the big problem, and this is what we want to talk about, the main topic. Sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is a principle that governments cannot be sued. Now, it's had a number of justifications. The original justification is that the sovereign himself is immune, in other words, the king. The next justification that was made for that was that, and the one that I agree with, is that the reason why the sovereign has to be immune is because the sovereign doesn't have any money. When you're talking about a government, whether it be a city, county, state, federal government, it doesn't have any assets. It doesn't have any money. The only money that it has is money that it takes from someone else through taxation. So it's my contention that sovereigns have to be immune, although I would like them to be much, much smaller and not make these kinds of promises. But the reason why they have to be immune is because if they make a promise to you and they don't pay, that means they're going to take the money from me and give it to you. They're going to rob Peter to pay Paul. So let's look at sovereign immunity here. Sovereign immunity in the United States is the legal privilege by which American federal, state, and tribal governments cannot be sued. Local governments in most jurisdictions enjoy immunity from some forms of suit, particularly in tort. Foreign governments enjoy immunity from suit as provided in the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. In the United States, the federal government has sovereign immunity and may not be sued unless it has waived its immunity or consented to suit. Now, it's going to go way into law and the explanations for it, but you understand the basic principle. You can't sue the government. So let's look at this decision here, because this one is specific to a particular suit. We're going to read a little bit about the municipality and the case that happened. Basically, there were a couple of doctors here who decided to build a building based upon potential tax liability, and then the thing was changed unilaterally and they decided to sue. In October 2008, doctors Etan and Vered Sobel bought a residential property in Rutland City with the intention of tearing down the house and developing a medical practice building on the lot. Thereafter, they contacted the Rutland City tax advisor by telephone and followed up with a series of emails asking for property tax estimates for various buildings they proposed to construct. Based on representations made by the doctors, the assessor provided some rough estimates of the appraised value of the proposed buildings and the doctors' potential property tax liability. The doctors went ahead with construction. The final cost of construction was approximately $700,000. After the building was completed, the assessor inspected and assessed the plaintiff's property tax of $649,000. In June of 2010, the assessor received an email from the doctor stating that they were surprised to receive your letter, etc., etc. So basically what happened was that these doctors did not like the tax bill that they got on their building after they were promised something that they thought was different. Now, this went to court, and it's an important case because it's talking about municipal immunity. So this is sovereign immunity on the municipal level, but it's the same principle. You can't sue the government because they don't have any money. The Superior Court granted summary judgment for the city, holding that the city was protected against suit by municipal immunity because the assessor's estimates arose from the city's governmental function of assessment and collection of taxes. The court further held that the doctors could not meet the elements of equitable estoppel. On appeal to the Vermont Supreme Court, the Superior Court's decision was affirmed, with the Supreme Court holding that the assessor's tax estimates were protected by municipal sovereign immunity. So there you have it. The principle of sovereign immunity extends all the way down to city government. You can't sue the government. You can't come after the government and say, you promised us this and you have to pay up, and if you don't, we're going to sue you. And the reason that's given is that this is the king, and you can't sue the king. And then the next reason they give is you can't sue the entity that makes the laws. You can't use the laws of the entity that makes the laws to sue them. But the real reason that you can't sue the government is because the government doesn't have any money. And if you sue the government and win, all that means is the government has to go out and take somebody else's money and give it to you. And that's what Rahm Emanuel implied when he talked about either horrendous property tax increases or horrendous cuts. The government doesn't have any money. So, back to silver, that's the reason why you have to stack physical silver and physical gold and any other physical assets, because the government does not have to keep its promises. It will not keep its promises, and when it fails to keep its promises, you cannot force it to keep its promises because it is immune to being sued. And if you do sue it, and even if it consents to be sued and you win, you're going to find out that there aren't any assets for you to take. That's what we're seeing in Detroit, where the tax base is now eroded to the point that it doesn't matter whether a judge even decides for the government workers. There's still no money to be had. So this is going to be the major situation going forward. I think 2014 is going to be a year of massive waves of bankruptcies through municipalities, counties, states, and of course the federal government ultimately. And you cannot rely on promises made by government. When you go to collect them, they're not going to be there. And we'll talk to you next time.